Hi everybody, it's Cash. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. There's a microphone here now so that you can hear me better and there's less echo. But I know I said that I was going to post a video about the energy of breakfast cereals, and I will still do that in a couple of days' time. But there's been a change of plan for a very significant reason. Many of you over the past couple of years have said, why don't you do transition pictures for an atheist? What happens to an atheist after they die? Now, I did Christopher Hitchens back in 2021, but he wasn't an atheist, he was an anti-theist. He thought that anything to do with God was just bad for the world, and Christianity was bad for the world. But I've never done a real and pure atheist before. Well, on Sunday, my longest standing friend, actually, I met him in college, Peter, died of cancer. He was exactly the same age as me, and after half a century together, it's pretty shocking that he died at only 67. But the thing about Peter was that he was a committed, almost aggressive atheist. He was anti-religion, he was anti-Christian, he didn't believe in anything. In college he studied mathematics, and he lived his life in a black and white way, really. There was no grey. He was constantly about seeking sensation and satisfying his impulses. So if Peter wanted an ice cream sundae, Peter went and had an ice cream sundae. If Peter wanted microwave pizza, he went and got a microwave pizza. He didn't care about the health ramifications, he didn't care what other people thought, and he was the same about beliefs. He just believed what he believed. He would never try to convince you of anything else. But he didn't believe in God, Christianity, Jesus, anything, and was actively repulsed by it. So I made the mistake once of sending him a Christmas card. This is many, many years ago when I was very naive about these things. And apparently he just handed it back to the postman without opening it. Didn't even know it was from, just handed it back and said, "No, thank you." Closed the door. Not interested at all. I'm not going to show you a photo of him because I think that would be very, very unfair. But just so that you understand the transition pictures, this is the kind of person he was. He was a nudist at one point. He was also a committed beer drinker and fell into that whole real ale thing back in the 70s and 80s, where people went away from mass-produced factory fizzy beer to real draft homebrew type beer that was becoming very popular. He helped spearhead that movement. Now, I never knew whether he was an alcoholic or whether he just loved beer, because he had that impulse thing going on, seeking sensation. So he would have about 10 beers per night sometimes, which meant that his weight ballooned to about 330 pounds, and it brought with it a lot of illness, of course. He had a brain tumor at one point, and epilepsy, and heart problems, and Bell's palsy, I think. Lots and lots of different health problems. But Peter didn't care. He wasn't motivated by his health. He was motivated by seeking sensation. I think in his late 50s, early 60s, when he was about 330 pounds, he took up competitive pipe smoking for contests where they would see how much tobacco you could smoke in the shortest time, I guess. And eventually he got cancer, which spread throughout his body and took him pretty quickly. I thought that it was going to be next year when he went down with it, but it took him very, very quickly. It was very, very aggressive. I did his pictures when he wrote and said he was going to die, and there was no long-term picture for him. And it showed a path going up so that I think he was in hospital when he wrote, that he would steadily improve from where he was at that particular time. But at the top of the slope, The road, the path, whatever it was, the highway, just went straight down into a pit. If he managed to overcome that and go past it, it still got incredibly murky and cloudy and would be very difficult to survive. A couple of weeks after that, I wrote to him again and said, "How are you doing?" And I didn't hear anything back. So I went into the energy again, and it was the same path, but he was dangling off the side of it. He was having trouble climbing it. And then I assume got to the pit in the road, the ravine, and went down. So I decided I would do his transition pictures yesterday. And this is a set of transition pictures for a committed atheist who believes that life ends and there is nothing else. You die and you're gone. When I went into Peter's energy, there was that mini crevasse in the path. And he went straight down it. But it was getting thinner and thinner and thinner. I'm assuming the cancer took its toll on his body and he lost weight towards the end. But the passageway down was very, very narrow and he had trouble squeezing through it. The pathway curved around at the bottom and he was left there sort of raised up on his elbows or on his hands looking around. There was an element here of impatience, of dissatisfaction, of like, it was an inconvenience. Can we just get this over with, please? The worst part's behind me. Now let's just finish it. In the path, as he crawled along, metaphorically speaking, of course, this is his consciousness we're talking about. In the middle of the path was a hump that he had to climb over. I wonder whether there was an issue of medication here or people trying to keep him alive or something because he couldn't get over this hump initially. But then he did, he managed to clamber over it. And then a little further on, he came to that symbolic cave that I always see in these pictures. And he poked his head out a bit like a fox pokes its head out of a hole. Once you reach that metaphorical cave, you are gone. You are dead at that point. And he was dead. It's not a place, though. It's more a sense of presence, a state of being. And he was on his knees, basically. He got up to his knees and he looked around and was trying to find an expectation that he could hang on to. What am I supposed to do here? What's my next step? This is how he was all those years that I knew him in college and afterwards. He was always like, so, okay, what are we going to do? What's next? I go from A to B. I want a pizza. I'm just going to go and get a pizza. And that would be it. There would be no grey area. And he was the same here. The guy hadn't changed. He was the same Peter and said, okay, what's expected of me here? What am I supposed to do? Where do I go? And he was drawn, as everybody is, towards the tunnel. There's a tunnel. I must climb it. That's what I'm expected to do. Very pragmatic. Interestingly, all the ailments he'd endured in form were gone. All those tiresome things, including deafness. He was deaf in one ear after his brain tumor operation. All of that, gone. He was free now. He felt lighter. He felt energized, reinvigorated as he made his trek up the tunnel. And the tunnel contained little walls, I seem to remember, like one after the other, like going around a maze. And he had to go round like that and round like that and weave in between them in order to make progress. And what you find when people encounter these kinds of obstacles, it's like wearing you down, trying to rid you of some of the resistance that you have to ultimate ascension when you get to the light. And Peter had a lot of these in this tunnel, weaving in and out and in and out. trying to shake off, rub off, scrape off some of his willfulness, his determination, his humanness, which was getting in the way of his spirituality. Interestingly, while he was anti-Christian, he was one of the most Christian people I've ever met. Generous, loving, kind, but spontaneously so, because that's what was inside of him. Everything else was a crust of affectation, in a way, that had to be worn down. And when he finally arrived at the light, he was still pragmatic. He said, okay, this is the end of the process. This is where my life ends. This is exactly what I expected. I think he was relieved that he didn't have to endure the realization that God was here or Jesus was there to meet him or anything he dreaded like that. This was simply a process. Your consciousness winding down to the light and you die. And he opened a flap in the dome thing that I tend to see at these points. He opened a flap and just peered inside. It's like, oh, okay, this is where I go. And he climbed in, closed it behind him like a shower curtain or a changing room curtain, and went. No ceremony, no doubt, no fear, no questioning, no curiosity, no awe, no wonder, except that I felt a tingle of something as he was closing those flaps. Now, I am not allowed to go beyond the dome. I do not know what happens there. But I got this feeling, this last minute feeling, that there was some kind of frisson of rejuvenation, taking away that crust of resistance and like, oh, what's next? That kind of boyish enthusiasm that he had when I knew him. What's going to happen? Where is this going to take me? Something new was about to happen. It was so split second that it came and it went, and I couldn't quite identify it, but it felt like that. Like he'd had an epiphany about something in that split second that he couldn't have when he was simply going through what he saw as the motions. And he was welcomed by grace the same way all souls are when they're returning home. But he wasn't denied it simply because he denied the existence of it. He went through it anyway because that's all we are. We are, as I always say, drops returning to the ocean. By contrast, I have another friend who's in her 90s now, who is in the latter stages of hospice care, lying in a bed in a home, eyes closed, waiting, I suppose, for the end to come. We don't know what's going on in her head, and I'm not going to do somebody's transition before they actually die. I think that's unethical. But I can do her crossover since she is so close to it now. And this was really interesting because remember when Peter had that shaft that went down, only it got really, really thin? She had a shaft too, a vertical shaft, but it had a ladder on it. And she was halfway down the ladder. It was light at the top, and then something below her. It was like she was climbing down the inside of a well. A friend of mine went to see her and held her hand and said, "Do you know who I am?" And she said yes, very quietly. But there was a feeling that she, in that moment, could either come to the surface, climb back up the ladder to open her eyes and say hi, or she could continue on down. And she was fascinated by what lay below. It was effort versus no effort. Just keep on going down, taking the steps, the rungs, one at a time. At the bottom, it curved around. Only in her tunnel, there was the most wonderful little lake. A beautiful, dazzling, glistening lake. It felt like a liquid sunset. And She was absolutely awed by the sight of this and lulled into sitting on the floor, metaphorically, and staring at it. Almost like, I want to stay here forever. This is my happy place. This is my reward for a life well lived. I think she actually thought that's what death might be, just sitting by a wonderful, beautiful lake and feeling relaxed and calm. But in actual fact, after a while spent sitting by this little lake and staring at it, she decided to wade into it, because you just feel this sense of movement, this current. You have to go with the current. You can't sit still. And after delaying a bit by sitting by the side of the lake, she decided to wade into it. And as she waded into it, it vanished. This was the process becoming real. It went from being mental, imaginary, dreamy, to being practical reality. Her consciousness was departing, and she had to go with it. And she walked along, reached that cave, as always, that I always see. Purely metaphorical, but she reached it. And she danced. She rejoiced in this moment, which would echo her life in a way. She flung herself around. Her spirit was free. No more of the human encumbrances that she'd had. No more rules she lived by. No more principles. Everything else, it was all gone. And now she could just dance. And that was magical too. But Peter had none of that dancing or awe or wonder. It was simply a practical process of dying. And then at the end, a little special something. Little frisson, little tingle of possibility, of enlightenment maybe? A sense of what was possible now, and which he denied himself access to for 67 years while he was in form. I thought that was amazing. I did these pictures in a cafe, actually not far from here. And I left the cafe afterwards, actually a little teary. I mean, it was very, very moving to see my friend go through this, but also to think that I'd lost him over the weekend. Especially when I'm the same age as him, and any one of us could go at any minute, I guess. But I walked up the street thinking about this. And ahead of me, there were all these people lined up with their phones out, taking pictures. I mean, right the way up the street. It was something I've not seen before. Everybody just standing in the street, pointing their cameras, their phones at something. And when I got to a space where I could actually see what they were looking at, there was the most magnificent rainbow. Obviously, millions of people will have seen that same rainbow, probably. But to me, it just felt like a moment. I'd seen Peter through, as his friend, all the way to the end, to his ascension. And this was him saying, "Thanks, I'll see ya." I don't know, it just felt magical to me. So that's what I learned from Peter. That it doesn't matter how strict your beliefs or denials when you're in your humanness. Once you transcend that and you're purely in your beingness, you get to experience death the same way everybody else does. Your consciousness dwindles the way everybody else's does. And you go to the light, and you're greeted by grace. and you're embraced by unconditional love. That makes me very happy. I'm going to miss you, Peter. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.